I used to believe love could make a family out of anyone. When I married Bill, I didn't just gain a husband. I gained a little girl with freckles and shy eyes who called me Miss Maggie before she ever called me Mom. For 30 years, I worked double shifts at the elementary school and saved every spare dollar for her future. I didn't buy myself much, just the basics and the occasional second-hand book. Everything else went to Clara. Tuition, rent, wedding expenses, you name it, I covered it. I told myself it was worth it to see her happy, to give her the life her father would have wanted. But I learned something the hard way. When you give some people the world, they don't see the gift. They just see what's left to take. The day she told me to pack up and go, I didn't cry. I just listened and started planning. When I first met Bill, I was 42, and I'd already made peace with the idea that life might just stay quiet. I had my classroom, small cottage, and a rhythm that didn't leave much room for surprises. He came into my world on an autumn afternoon, the kind that smelled like coffee and rain, and he was exactly what I never knew I was missing. Gentle where life had been rough, funny in that calm way that only men who've lived through storms can be. He wasn't alone, though. He had a little girl named Clara. She was 10 at the time, small, quiet, and always half hidden behind him, like a shadow that hadn't quite learned how to step into the sun. The first time she met me, she wouldn't look me in the eye. She clutched her book against her chest and nodded when I said hello, like she was afraid I might ask her something she didn't have an answer to. I didn't push her. I just smiled and said, "That's a good book, sweetheart," and let her know that I saw her, even if she wasn't ready to see me. For the first few months, everything moved gently. Bill and I went for walks, had dinners that ended with laughter and dishes drying on the rack. Clara always sat quietly at the table, polite, careful with her words. I'd ask about school, and she'd answer with short sentences, the way children do when they don't know yet if they're safe to open up. Bill used to say, "She just needs time, Maggie. Her mama left when she was little. She'll warm up eventually." And she did, little by little. It started with small things, her helping me set the table or leaving her drawings on the kitchen counter where she knew I'd find them. One morning, I found a note tucked in my purse. It said, in uneven letters, "Thank you for the pancakes." I kept that note for years, folded and soft at the edges. By the time Bill and I got married, she had started calling me Miss Maggie, which made me laugh every time. I didn't want to rush her into calling me anything else. Love, especially in blended families, can't be demanded. It has to be offered, accepted slowly like a hand extended that you hope will be taken. We bought a modest house on the edge of town, a little craftsman with creaky floors and a porch that caught the morning light. It wasn't fancy, but it felt like a home. Soft yellow walls, the smell of coffee and books, the faint sound of Clara's piano practice floating through the evenings. I used to sit in the living room grading papers listening to her play. Bill would hum along, out of tune, pretending he wasn't. It was ordinary, but it was good. Life has a way of giving you peace just long enough for you to start believing it'll last. A few years after the wedding, Bill got sick. It started with a cough he couldn't shake, then hospital visits that filled the calendar. Through it all, I kept teaching, kept cooking, kept holding things together, because that's what women like me do. Clara was 15 by then, old enough to understand what was happening, but too young to face it. She started pulling away, spending more time at friends' houses, staying late at school. I didn't blame her. Everyone handles grief differently. The night Bill passed, the house was silent in that strange, heavy way that makes you hear your own heartbeat. I remember standing at the window after they took him, watching the streetlight flicker on the corner, thinking how strange it was that the world just kept turning. Clara was in her room, crying quietly. I wanted to go in to hold her, but I knew she needed space. Later, when she came out, her face was red and tired, and she just looked at me and said, "You'll stay, right?" "I'm not going anywhere," I told her, and I meant it. After the funeral, things were slow to mend. I threw myself into work. Clara finished high school and talked about college, about leaving town. I encouraged her, even though part of me wished she'd stay a little longer. She had dreams, big ones, and I wasn't about to stand in her way. I promised her I'd help however I could. Money was tight. Teaching never made anyone rich, but I'd saved over the years, small deposits, careful spending, no vacations, no new car. It wasn't much, but it was enough to help her get started. I told her, "Education is something no one can take from you. You build that, and it's yours for life." She smiled and said, "You sound like one of your lessons, Miss Maggie." That was the last time she called me that. As she grew older, our phone calls grew shorter. She was busy, always busy, new city, new friends, new boyfriend. I told myself it was normal, that she was finding her own way, that distance didn't mean indifference. But deep down, I missed her. I missed the sound of her laughter in the kitchen, the way she'd roll her eyes when I made corny jokes, the way she used to leave little notes for me. I kept waiting for her to come home for a holiday, but every year there was some reason she couldn't. Still, I kept her room exactly as she left it. Soft blue walls, a little bookshelf, a quilt I made when she was 16. I dusted it every Saturday, even though no one was coming. Some people said it was foolish, but it gave me comfort. It was a way of holding on to the part of my life that still felt like family. Years passed quietly. I'd see her name pop up on the phone screen once a month, sometimes less. Our conversations were polite, almost formal. She'd tell me about work, her new apartment, her plans. I'd listen, ask questions, and tell her how proud I was. And I was proud, even when the space between us kept widening. I didn't realize it then, but every time I sent her money, every time I covered a bill or loaned her what little extra I had, I was drawing from a well that was slowly running dry. I didn't mind, though. When you love someone, you don't count the cost. You just give, believing that someday they'll understand. It took. Sometimes late at night, I'd catch myself talking to Bill's picture. "She's doing fine," I'd tell him. "You'd be proud. She's thought your stubbornness." It made me feel closer to both of them somehow, even though I was the only one left in that house. Then one day Clara called with excitement in her voice I hadn't heard in years. "I got accepted, Maggie. A full university program, business and management," she said, almost breathless. But the tuition, I already knew where this was going. I told her not to worry. I'd make it work. She hesitated, said she didn't want to be a burden. But deep down, I think she knew I'd say yes. That's what mothers do, even when they're only mothers by heart, not by blood. I remember sitting at the kitchen table that night, calculator in hand, adding numbers that didn't quite fit together. I can almost hear Bill's voice saying, "Don't stretch yourself too thin, Maggie." But then I'd look at Clara's high school photo on a shelf, the one where she's smiling shyly, and I'd think, what else am I here for, if not to help her? So I did it. I took a loan against the house and sent her the money. It wasn't easy, but it felt right. I told myself it was what Bill would have wanted. For a while I heard from her more often. She'd call to say thank you, to share stories about classes and professors. I'd listen for hours, imagining her walking across campus, confident and bright. It made every sacrifice worth it. But time has a way of teaching you what people are truly made of. As the months went on, the calls became shorter again. Then fewer. By the time graduation came, I didn't even get an invitation. Just a short text. "Graduation went great, thanks for everything." I sat at the kitchen table that night, that same spot where I'd once balanced the numbers and told myself love would be enough. I set down my cup of tea, looked around the empty house, and whispered, "You're welcome, sweetheart." That was when I realized something. Sometimes the promises you make out of love can become the chains that bind you. But I didn't see the full shape of that truth yet. That would come later when she came back home, not as the girl I'd raised, but as someone I barely recognized. I remember the day the acceptance letter came as clear as if it were yesterday. The envelope was thick and official-looking, with the college crest stamped in blue ink across the top. I was in the garden trimming the hydrangeas when Clara came running out from the mailbox, waving that letter like it was a ticket to heaven. "Miss Maggie, I got in," she shouted, still calling me that sometimes, even though she was 20 now. Her face was lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years. The shy little girl who used to dance around the kitchen was suddenly back for a moment. I took the envelope from her, careful not to smudge the ink with my gardening gloves, and when I read the first line, my heart swelled. "Congratulations," it said. And that was all I needed. I hugged her, dirt and all, and she laughed into my shoulder. For a brief second it felt like everything Bill and I had done, the long nights, the penny pinching, the quiet patience, had led to this. But when I glanced down at the rest of the letter and saw the tuition figures, my stomach dropped. The numbers looked like they belonged to someone else's life, not ours. It wasn't just expensive, it was impossible. Still, when Clara looked up at me with those bright eyes, full of hope and expectation, I said the only thing I could. "We'll make it work." That night, after she went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with my old checkbook and a yellow notepad, trying to make the math line up. It didn't, not by a long shot. My savings account had enough to cover a couple of semesters if I stretched it. I thought about the small pension I'd get from the school, but it wasn't much. I told myself I could take on tutoring or maybe part-time work at the library. I'd find a way. I always had. The next morning, I went to the bank, the same branch I'd been visiting for 20 years. The teller, an older man named Jim, recognized me immediately. "Mornin', Mrs. Willis," he said with that friendly tone that made bad news sound gentler. "What brings you in today?" I told him I wanted to look into taking out a home equity loan. His eyebrows lifted slightly, and he hesitated before nodding. "For renovations?" he asked, the way they always do. "For my daughter's college," I said, the words slipping out naturally. It felt good to say my daughter, even if technically she wasn't mine by blood. I'd raised her. I'd held her through nightmares. I'd paid for braces, music lessons, all of it. That had to count for something. He smiled, polite and efficient, and within the hour I was signing papers I only half understood, trusting that this sacrifice was another brick in the foundation of her future. I didn't think about risk. I didn't think about the years it might take to pay it off. I just thought about that moment she'd walk across a graduation stage, cap and gown swaying, and look back into the crowd to find me. I could almost see it. When Clara found out, she hugged me tight and said, "You didn't have to do that." But of course I did. That's what parents do. They move mountains for their children, even when they know those mountains might fall back on them someday. The first few months after she left for college were quiet. Too quiet. I still woke up early to make breakfast, even though no one was there to eat it. I'd catch myself setting 2 plates out on the table before realizing it was just me. Old habits die slow. Clara called every week at first. She'd tell me about her classes, her new friends, her roommate. Talked too loud in the coffee shop where she studied. I'd listen, smiling, imagining her in a world so much bigger than the one we built. I'd end each call the same way. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart," and I was, even when the calls started coming less often. Once a week turned into once every other week, then once a month. I told myself it was normal. Kids get busy. College life has a way of sweeping you up. Every time the mail came, I'd look for her handwriting, that looping, confident script she used to sign her name. Sometimes a letter would arrive, short, rushed, full of stories about exams and dorm drama. I'd read them twice, sometimes 3 times, just to hear her voice in my head. But as the semesters passed, the letters stopped too. I still sent care packages, cookies, sweaters, little notes tucked between folded clothes. She'd text a quick thank you sometimes. Other times, nothing. But I kept sending them anyway. That's what love does. It keeps giving even when it's not being noticed. When the first tuition renewal came due, I barely blinked. I cashed a small CD I'd been saving for retirement. When the second came, I picked up a tutoring job after school, helping local kids with reading and math. I told the other teachers I enjoyed keeping busy, but the truth was I needed the extra money. By the 3rd year, my hands ached from writing lesson plans late into the night, but I didn't complain. Every sacrifice felt like a step closer to the finish line, not mine, but hers. Graduation day came and went quietly. There was no phone call, no letter, no photo of her in that cap and gown. I told myself she must be busy. Maybe she'd send one later. But deep down I knew. The silence said everything. That night I sat in her old room. The air still smelled faintly of her shampoo, lavender and something sweet. The bed was neatly made, just as I'd left it after the last time I washed her sheets. On the dresser sat a photo of her as a teenager, sitting next to me on the porch steps, her head tilted toward mine. She'd been smiling then. I reached out and touched the edge of the frame, and for a moment I could almost hear her laugh again. I started dusting that room every Saturday. It became a ritual. Wipe the shelves, straighten the books, fold the extra blanket. I didn't do it because it needed cleaning. I did it because it made me feel like she was still part of my life somehow. Some evenings, after finishing dinner, I'd sit at the kitchen table and reread old letters. The paper had softened over time, the ink faded slightly, but the words still felt alive. "I love you, Miss Maggie," one said. Another, "You're my home." I'd fold them carefully, place them back in the drawer, and close it quietly like a secret. There were times I caught myself wondering if I'd done too much. If maybe by giving her everything, I'd taken away the chance for her to learn gratitude. But then I'd scold myself for thinking like that. She was young, ambitious. The world was wide and fast. Maybe this was just what growing up looked like now. Then came a letter from the bank, a reminder of payments due. I remember standing in the kitchen, holding that paper, realizing how small my world had become. The numbers felt heavy, but I didn't regret it. I still don't. Love doesn't work on ledgers. It's not supposed to. Every once in a while, a neighbor would ask how Clara was doing, and I'd smile and say, "She's doing great, busy girl." It was easier than explaining the truth, that I didn't really know. On Christmas, I made her favorite cookies and mailed the box to her address at the university. Weeks went by, and then one day the package came back, unopened, with a red stamp across it, returned to sender. I stared at it for a long time before opening the box myself. The cookies were stale, the smell faint but familiar. I ate one anyway just to feel close to her. I suppose that's what love becomes. Eventually small acts you do alone, because they remind you of what used to be shared. Years passed. I retired from teaching. The mortgage payments kept coming, but I managed. The house stayed warm, the garden still bloomed, and Clara's room stayed exactly the same. I'd walk by the doorway sometimes and glance inside, imagining she might return one day, maybe with a husband, maybe with kids, maybe just to say, "Thank you." But life rarely plays out the way we imagine. The years have a way of quieting our expectations, until all that's left is patience. One morning while I was watering the plants on the porch, I saw her name flash on my phone screen. It startled me. I hadn't seen it in so long that I almost thought it was a mistake. "Hi, Maggie," she said, her voice older, but still carrying that same edge of control. I was thinking, maybe I could come home for a bit, just until I get things sorted out. My heart leapt, but something in her tone made me pause. Still, I said yes before I could think better of it. Because no matter how many years had passed, no matter how distant she'd become, a part of me still hoped this time would be different. I didn't know it then, but her return would be the beginning of everything that followed. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the quiet justice that would come years later, and all started with that phone call. The day Clara walked up my front steps with a suitcase, and that bright, nervous smile, it felt like someone had opened a window in a room I'd been sitting in for too long. She looked different, more polished, the way time and the city change people. But when she hugged me, her arms fit around me the same way they always had. She had that look of somebody who wanted to impress, who'd been practicing a life full of appointments and plans. She introduced me to Daniel, tall, soft-spoken, with a careful handshake, and they both seemed so relieved to be home, even if just for a little while. "You're staying?" I asked, as if I hadn't been hoping for this for years. "For a bit," she said, and her voice had that little edge of calculation I'd noticed before, the way she measured her words like they were currency. "We're trying to save up for a place of our own. It'll be temporary, Mom, just until we can get on our feet." The word Mom surprised me, like a stray note in a familiar song. I answered without thinking. "Of course, you're always welcome." I meant it. My heart felt full in that soft, cautious way it does when you allow joy back into a place that's been hollow for too long. For the first few days, it was as if the years had folded neatly. We ate pancakes at the same sagging kitchen table, argued about whose turn it was to wash the dishes, old domestic rituals that felt like medicine. Clara and Daniel moved into the spare bedroom. Clara took to humming in the mornings while she brewed coffee. Daniel would help me prune the roses because he liked the way the pruning shears felt in his hand. I watched them, and felt something warm and human ease into my chest. Then the little shifts started. Nothing dramatic at first, just a rearranged throw here, a different mug in the cabinet there. Clara would move a lamp from the living room to the dining room and say, "This will look better here," as if she were solving a design problem more than altering the place where I had lived for years. She began to leave notes on the fridge, grocery list and laundry days, and once a little sticky that read, "Let's clean out the attic this weekend." I smiled at them like a grandmother might smile at a child learning responsibility. It felt like participation. She started taking over small bills too. "I'll handle the internet this month," she'd say, as if it were a kindness. "You don't need to worry about it." I'd thank her. It seemed practical, neighborly. After all, she was here. She was part of the household again. I told myself that accepting help didn't make me weak. It made sense. We were family. Family shares. There were comments, too, slipped casually into conversation, that left a tiny chill. Once while I was folding laundry, she said, "It's so nice to be back in a house with good furniture. Must have been good years for you here, huh?" She said it lightly, but the underlying tone sounded like appraisal, like she was cataloging the assets of a life she hadn't built herself. I laughed it off because I didn't want to be the woman who bit back at her own child. Maybe she was just remarking, I thought. People say stupid things when they're tired. Gradually, the way she spoke about the place changed. It began with little possessive phrases. Our living room looks great now, or we should repaint this room. And the we felt like someone else moving into the sentence. At night, I'd sit at the kitchen table, the same place I'd balanced bills and held grief, and listen to them in the other room talking about paint colors and where they might keep their coats. I remember thinking for a moment about the layers of life, how a house wears the memories of everyone who has passed through it, how the same floorboards could be a map of love, and sometimes of quiet theft. They started inviting friends over. At first I thought it was good for Clara to reconnect with people. She'd been living a more isolated life in the city. But then there were more cars in the drive, voices late into the night, and a stack of mail addressed to both Clara and Daniel that came through my mailbox. Packages arrived with modern gadgets and subscriptions I'd never seen before. I'd bring them in from the porch, and Clara would say, "Oh, I meant to put that outside. I'll get it." There was an ease now in walking through my home as if it was partly hers, an ease that made me feel like a guest in the place I'd tended for decades. One evening, as the rain tapped the windows and the house smelled like stew, Clara announced over dinner, "I've started looking into refinancing options. We could fix up the porch, make it more open." Daniel nodded, supportive. I paused, fork halfway to my mouth, and asked what she meant. She explained with a neat practiced clarity about mortgage points and interest rates as if we were sorting through a math problem. "Just thinking ahead," she said. "A house like this could be worth more with some investment." The words landed differently than she expected. I felt a prick of something. Was it hurt or confusion? "Why we?" I asked softly. "Isn't the mortgage still in my name?" Clara shrugged in a way that suggested I was being fussy. "You know how banks work, Mom? It's easier when both of us are on the account. It looks better if two people manage the payments." She said it like a fact, neatly trimmed of the emotional edges it carried. I told myself I was being old-fashioned. I'd spent my life trusting institutions and people in the ways my generation was taught to. The idea of paperwork and accounts felt dry compared to the warmth of the table. So I said yes, after a pause that lasted longer than either of us admitted. "If it helps," I muttered, "we can look into it." From then on, she handled more. She sat with the mail, sorted it, and explained bills in shorthand. She started making remarks about my spending, little suggestions about avoiding late fees or switching providers. Often she'd log into accounts and tell me the balance like she was managing a company ledger. I'd listen and nod, feeling the slow erosion of decision-making that had always been mine. Some of it felt helpful, practical. Some of it felt like a takeover staged like kindness. There were other moments, softer but heavier, that ached deeper. One afternoon I found the living room rearranged. My favorite armchair moved from its usual spot by the lamp to another corner. When I asked, Clara said with a casual smile, "Oh, I moved it so guests have a better view." It was the same chair Bill used to fall asleep in while watching the evening news. It had a groove worn into the cushion where his weight used to settle. She'd moved the chair as if rearranging the furniture could rearrange history. I kept quiet about smaller things because I wanted to be the steady one, the one who forgave and adjusted. I'd learned over the years that arguing rarely mended anything. It usually widened the distance. Besides, part of me genuinely wanted Clara to feel comfortable, to make this house her home the way I had once hoped she would. Maybe this was how she showed love, by making things modern and efficient. Maybe I was clinging to the past. But there were nights I'd lie awake, listening to the house and wondering whose life it was shaping. I'd think of Bill's voice, the way he'd say, "We built this together." I'd remember small things, the way Clara used to press her nose against the window on cold mornings when she was little, the time she learned to tie her shoes under my patient instructions. Those memories were like moths. I kept brushing off the curtains, and each new rearrangement felt like another wing torn. Then came the day Clara started paying bills without asking. A water bill came in with a note taped to it. Paid by Clara. A cable invoice was stamped, transferred to new account. I understand how relief can feel like gratitude. A bill covered is a burden lifted, but it also became a way for her to step into roles and decisions that used to be mine. She began telling me about the accounts she'd set up. the passwords she changed for convenience. She said, "This will all be easier if we keep everything streamlined." I nodded along because the words were reasonable, but my chest tightened in a way I couldn't easily explain. Small things, as I learned, are often the beginning of larger losses. If you allow someone to take the mantle of small choices, soon they'll be making the big ones. I kept reminding myself that patience was a virtue, that many children grow into their confidence only after years of testing the waters. I wanted to be generous. I wanted to believe in her. There were evenings she'd sweep me aside with a plan, and I'd feel invisible for a moment, like a ghost passing through my own rooms. Yet, when she laughed with Daniel over some future renovation, my heart would still ache with a tender, naive hope that they would include me, that they would ask, that they'd notice the way my hands trembled when I stood too long. I wanted to speak up. I wanted to say, "This is my home. I raised you here." But I stopped myself. What would that solve? Would raising my voice bring her back to the little girl who left me notes and fingerprints on jam jars? I didn't think so, and so I let things slide, choosing peace over petty battles, habit over confrontation. I told myself that this hospitality was just another form of love, that time would smooth the rough edges. But there was a small, persistent worry that hummed beneath my days, like a loose wire waiting to spark. I didn't know then how high the current would reach, or how quietly it would change the map of my life. I only knew that my house was filling with new names, new plans, and a growing ease that no longer required my permission. It was raining hard that afternoon, the kind of steady, soft rain that makes the world feel like it's been put in a slow cooker. Everything comes out gentler, blurred at the edges. I had been to the market, the canvas, bag heavy with vegetables and the smell of fresh bread tucked under my arm. The porch light was on when I pulled up because the sky had already gone the color of lead. I thought for a bright second that maybe Clara had come home earlier and left a note. Maybe she'd surprise me with tea. I'd been foolish enough to expect little kindnesses like that. When I reached the front step, my groceries slipped in my hand and clattered onto the mat. Boxes, dozens of them, neatly stacked in 2 rows by the door. Jacket boxes, a couple of milk crate-sized moving cartons, a lamp box that had already been taped shut. The sound of rain made them look softer somehow, as if they belonged in a painting, not in the place where my books had sat a moment before. My heart gave a small, confused leap. For a second I thought, maybe there were donations, people who'd heard I was struggling and wanted to help. That thought lasted about as long as the next blink. Clara was on the porch, standing with an umbrella that she hadn't bothered to open, as if she wanted to keep dry but not hide herself. Daniel stood a few paces behind her, coat on, looking a little like someone who'd stepped into the middle of a story and was waiting for his cue. Clara's face was calm, her hair was pinned neatly, and there was no tremor in her voice when she said, "You're home." I dropped my bag and went up the steps, and the rain felt like it was in slow motion around me. "Clara?" I asked, because the thing adults say when they're a little disbelieving is a question. She smiled, a small, precise thing, and didn't answer in the way I expected. "We've been sorting things," she said, as casually as someone might announce that they'd reorganized the pantry. "You know, getting rid of clutter. We thought it'd be easier if you lived somewhere simpler for a while, less to worry about." The words landed like small stones in my chest. "Simpler?" I repeated. "Clara, what do you mean?" She stepped forward and opened one of the boxes so I could see inside. My sweaters, folded, neat as always, a stack of my teaching certificates wrapped in tissue. My favorite mug, the one that says "World's Okayest Teacher." Finally, on the very top lay a small, familiar quilt I'd made years ago, edges soft from washing. It looked like the house itself had been folded into cardboard. "I don't want to argue," Clara said. "We've talked about this. You were struggling a bit, Mom. The house needs someone who—" She didn't finish the sentence the way people often don't finish sentences when they are being kind and cruel at the same time. "Who can keep up?" "Keep up?" I said, and I remember the sound of my voice like a stranger's voice. "You put my things out on the porch." She tilted her head like someone explaining a small inconvenience. "We thought you'd like a fresh start. It's better for you to be somewhere smaller right now. We found a little place we can help you with for a couple of months. We'll set you up. Think of it as a rest." I should have been angry. I should have shouted or at least asked what had started this. Instead, my first thought was practical and stupidly ordinary. Where would I put the bread? The mind has a way of collecting little domestic things when the world threatens to pull apart. "Clara, you can't just—" I started. She held up a hand. Listen, I handled the paperwork. It's sorted. You don't need to worry about anything. Her tone was gentle, the kind that means a decision has already been made, and the speaker is offering the listener the courtesy of being informed. I took a step back, and the porch under my feet felt suddenly too small. Handled the paperwork, I echoed. What paperwork? Clara's face finally showed a flicker, just a tiny rounding at the corner of her mouth, like someone who's about to recite something rehearsed. You signed the tax forms the last time you were feeling overwhelmed. Remember? You said you wanted someone to help manage things. You signed a few papers and told me to worry less. She folded her hands as if making a neat little present out of the memory. I just updated the deed to make things simpler. It's in both our names now. The world slowed. I remember being aware of the sound of the rain more than anything else, like it was the soundtrack to a silent film, and I'd wandered into the wrong theater. You said it. The syllables came out like cold. You trusted me, she said. You told me to help. I did what you asked. The bank was happy with the change. We made everything official. You'll still get visits from the bank if anything ever comes up. Honestly, this is just practical. There it was, the gentle word that is often used to smooth over sharp edges. Practical. I felt a small, absurd laugh bubble up, because if this were a practical matter, why were my books on the porch like evidence of a crime? Clara's eyes are a certain gray blue. I'd known that color since she was 10, and now it felt like a foreign sky. I want you to picture this. The neighbor's begonias bowed under the rain, Mrs. Hargrove watching from her window across the street, with that sympathetic face neighbors have when they see drama that isn't theirs. The boxes smell faintly of cardboard and something that used to be mine. My hands found the quilt without thinking, fingers remembering the stitch pattern as if it were a prayer. I folded it over my arm because it felt necessary, an anchor in the drift. Why didn't you tell me? I asked finally, because sometimes the simplest question is the most honest. Clara shrugged as if the question required effort. You said you didn't want to worry about taxes. I was helping. I didn't think you wanted to be bothered. I thought you'd be glad. There was a part of me that felt ridiculous for being stunned. After all, I'd signed a few forms, and in the swirl of life with a mortgage and bills and a funeral, people sign things trusting others. But the difference between trust and authority had always been the fine line, dividing a hand held and a hand that writes your name into a ledger. I felt the ground tilt because I realized where that name now lived. Clara, I said, trying to put the words together without breaking them. You can't just take a house like that. This is our home, Bill and I. She cut me off gently. Bill left things messy. You know that. I fixed it. This isn't about taking anything. This is about moving forward. She looked at me without heat, which was somehow worse than anger. I want the house to be used, Mom. It's old. People your age don't need big homes. It's good to downsize. What about asking me? The question came out small. It felt like bargaining in the dark. You overwhelmed, she said again. I thought I was helping. There was an innocence to her words, as if a child had taken a cookie and believed that because they were the one with a sweet tooth, the right to a cookie belonged to them. I remember sitting on the bottom step, the rain cooling my knees. My legs felt thin, as if I'd been folded into luggage and carried half the world away. The boxes, polite and orderly, sat on the porch. Someone had labeled them in a neat, modern font, Maggie Personal, as if labeling could absolve the act. Daniel shuffled his feet and offered to take some boxes to the car, hands quick and efficient. He seemed embarrassed, like a man who knows the rules of common decency and is watching them bend. Clara helped too, her movements crisp. I stood and watched them pack my life into cubic feet and tape. There was a slow, almost ceremonial quality to the packing, like watching someone pack away a museum exhibit. The framed photographs went last. I took one of Bill and me from our wedding, both of us younger, smiling at each other, with the kind of foolish hope only the young can afford. I tucked it under my arm like contraband. I put in the little ceramic bird Bill had brought back from a fishing trip, the stack of letters from Claire's school play, the folded apron I kept for when visitors came. My hands moved with a quiet efficiency I didn't know I had left. When everything had been placed into cardboard and stacked neatly, Clara handed me a small envelope with a check and a sheet listing a couple of temporary addresses. We found a small place, she said. It's clean. It's near the clinic. You can be close to help. The check was polite, the amount calculated, the figure going to the nearest round number. It felt like change given for a coin you'd never asked to trade. I will come by and help set you up, she added. Don't worry, we'll make sure this is easy. I wanted to tell her then that there are some troubles that money cannot make easy, that a home is not merely walls and a mortgage, but a history of midnights and breakfasts, and the way your son laughed when he made coffee too strong. I wanted to tell her that trust is not something you revise on a form and hand back to someone like a receipt. But I didn't shout. I stood, picked up the small suitcase I'd kept in the hall, the one with the map of a foreign place I'd never visited, and moved slowly because I wanted my actions to belong to me. I put my books in, slid in the wedding photograph, folded the quilt, and tucked in a couple of worn novels I'd been meaning to read again. The neighbors watched politely from a distance. Mrs. Hargrove brought a cake later that night, one of those old-fashioned lemon loaves that say, "Comfort in the way they are made." "For a change of pace," she murmured, and I smiled because I didn't want to be rude. The small paper box was the kind of kindness that makes the world livable. I placed the cake on top of my belongings like an offering. I closed the porch door behind me without slamming it. I didn't give Clara a parting speech because part of me understood that the loudness of such speeches often made everything uglier. I wanted a different kind of answer, something quieter and steadier, so I left the house in the rain with a few boxes and a head full of questions. I didn't know then the shape of what I'd do next. I only knew that I could not stay on someone's porch with my life boxed and labeled. I drove away with the wipers beating time and the radio playing a song I half remembered from years ago, the kind of song that makes your eyes go wet in public and you have to blink quickly to hide it. At the motel that night, I unpacked the photograph as if it were the last thing on earth I owned. I placed the picture of Bill and me where I could see it from the bed and smoothed the quilt across my lap like a blanket against cold. I felt small and loud at the same time. Small because my house was no longer mine. Loud because the silence that followed felt like an accusation I couldn't yet name. Lying there, listening to the rain, the edges of things sharpened, hurt sat beside me, heavy and honest. But under it, something else was starting to thrum, a small, steady determination that tasted like tea and rolled-up sleeves. I didn't know how I would do it, and that uncertainty frightened me. But I knew I would not let this be a quiet theft without a reply. The reply might be paperwork and patience, or it might be a long conversation at a kitchen table. I placed the photo by the bedside and closed my eyes, not in defeat, but in a kind of requisite rest before I began to plan. The apartment I found wasn't much, just a small place by the ocean, tucked between an old bakery and a bookstore, still smelled like dust and forgotten stories. The rent was cheap, the walls were thin, and the kitchen window faced the water. On quiet evenings, I'd stand there with a cup of tea and listen to the tide roll in, the sound folding over itself like it had nowhere else to go. People talk about heartbreak like it's a single moment, a clean break. But it isn't. It's a slow undoing. Some mornings I'd wake up and forget for a split second that my house, the one Bill and I built, the one where Clara took her first steps, wasn't mine anymore. Then I'd remember the boxes on the porch, the rain, her calm face, and it would hit all over again. Still, I kept moving. You have to. I taught myself to make coffee for one, to fill the quiet with music instead of questions. I went for walks every morning along the shore, breathing in the salt air, until it didn't sting anymore. I bought second-hand curtains, a used armchair, a lamp with a crooked shade that leaned little, just like me. The world, it turns out, doesn't stop for your sadness. It just waits for you to catch up. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes I'd stacked by the window, I found a folder wedged between lesson plans and tax papers. Old manila, the edges soft with age. It was labeled in Bill's handwriting, Will and Property. For a second I just stared at it, my hands still. I'd seen that folder before, years ago when Bill and I were doing a responsible thing, making sure our affairs were in order. Back then, I hadn't paid much attention to the details. We'd sat at the dining table, the smell of coffee between us, and he'd said, "If anything ever happens to me, Maggie, you keep this house. It's yours. Promise me that." And I had promised. I set the folder down on the small table and opened it carefully, like unwrapping something fragile. Inside were the original documents, the house deed, mortgage records, and at the very bottom, Bill's will. His handwriting was unmistakable, steady, neat, the way he'd written notes for his carpentry work. My eyes caught on one line in particular. "To my wife, Margaret Willis, I leave full and lifelong ownership of our home and property located at 74 Pine Hill Avenue. Lifelong ownership." I sat there for a long time, staring at those words. It felt like Bill was in the room again, speaking through that old paper. My heart started to race, not out of excitement, but out of something deeper. Clarity. For the first time in months, my grief began to shift shape, like clouds breaking apart after a storm. I knew what Clara had done was wrong, but I had assumed it was irreversible. I thought once your name was pushed out of something there was no way back. But as I looked at Bill's signature and the witness stamps, a thought crept in. What if she wasn't as careful as she thought? The next morning I visited the small bakery downstairs for coffee and ran into someone I hadn't seen in years, Henry Lawson. He'd been a teacher at my school before retiring, taught civics, and had a knack for making dry things like legal rights sound almost interesting. He was sitting by the window with a newspaper, same old glasses perched on his nose. "Margaret Willis," he said when he saw me. "Well, I'll be damned, I thought you moved away." We talked the way old colleagues do, weather, retirement, how the town had changed. But before I left, something in me spoke up. "Henry," I said quietly, "you used to help folks with paperwork, didn't you? Legal forms, things like that?" He smiled. "I did now and then. Why, you in some kind of bind?" I hesitated, then told him everything. Not all at once, but piece by piece, the papers Clara had slipped in front of me, the way she'd handled everything under the name of help, and the night I left my own porch with boxes instead of goodbyes. Henry listened without interrupting, his brow furrowing deeper with each word. When I finished, he sat back thinking. "You still got those old documents?" he asked. I told him I did. He offered to stop by the next day, and I agreed. That night, I barely slept. The sound of the ocean outside felt different, less like comfort, more like a pulse, steady and alive. The next morning, he came over with his old leather briefcase and reading glasses. We spread the papers across my small table. He went through them slowly, careful not to smudge the ink, asking quiet questions now and then. After a long silence, he looked up at me. "Margaret," he said softly, "your husband's will was never voided, and this," he tapped the newer deed that Clara had altered, "this is soppy work. I doubt she even went through a proper transfer process. She probably had you sign what's called a joint ownership form, but without notarization or your explicit consent to remove yourself from the primary deed, it's not valid, especially with this will still standing." I blinked, trying to absorb his words. "You mean she never actually owned it?" He smiled faintly, that old teacher's smile. "Not legally, no. You do, you always did." For a moment, I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. All the months of humiliation, the nights I'd wondered if I was foolish for trusting too much. It turned out I'd been right to trust Bill, even if not the living. Henry offered to make a few calls, to pull in an old lawyer friend who still did estate work. I agreed, grateful, but cautious. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to humiliate Clara. I just wanted what was mine, the piece of my life that had been stolen under the guise of family. Weeks passed, filled with letters, phone calls, and quiet anticipation. I'd walk by the ocean every morning, watching seagulls dive into the waves, telling myself to be patient. Justice, like tides, moves slow. Sure, finally, one chilly morning, Henry showed up with a thick envelope in hand. "It's done," he said simply. "The court reviewed everything. The property transfer Clara filed was ruled invalid. You're the rightful owner, completely." I stared at the papers, the black ink crisp and final, and felt a weight lift that I hadn't realized I was still carrying. For the first time in months, I breathed without feeling the air catch halfway. Henry grinned. "Told you. Never underestimated old school teacher who reads the fine print." When I thanked him, he just waved me off. "You took care of half this town's kids, Margaret. Consider this me returning the favor." It took a few more weeks for everything to settle. The official letter from the court, the reissued deed. I didn't tell Clara right away. There was no need for a dramatic confrontation, no shouting or tears. I wanted silence. Clean, deliberate silence. Then, one afternoon, she called. Her voice was bright, almost rehearsed. "Hi, Mom. I was wondering if you'd had a chance to look at the bank statement this month. There was some confusion with the property tax. I think they made a mistake on the address." I let her speak for a while, and when she finally paused, I said quietly, "There's no mistake, Clara. The house isn't yours." She laughed, quick and nervous. "What are you talking about?" "Bill's will," I said calmly. "It's still valid. Your changes were never legal. The court reviewed it. Everything's been corrected." There was silence on the other end. I could almost hear her trying to piece the world back together in her mind. "You went behind my back?" she finally said. "No," I answered softly. "You went behind mine. I just turned the light on." The line stayed quiet for a long time before she hung up. A month later, the official notice arrived at the house, or what she thought was hers. I didn't need to see her face when she opened it. I could picture it well enough. The disbelief, the frustration, maybe even a flicker of shame. When I finally drove back to Pine Hill Avenue, the road felt both familiar and foreign. The neighborhood looked smaller somehow, as if time had folded it into something I could hold. I parked by the curb and sat for a long moment before stepping out. The house was just as I remembered. The porch, the window boxes, the faint smell of lilacs. I walked up the steps and stood there quietly. The lock clicked when I turned the key. Inside it was still and dustier than I remembered. But it was mine. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of air through the hallway, it all felt like home coming back to life. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just moved through the rooms, touching the walls with the same gentle certainty you might use when greeting an old friend after years apart. Then, as evening settled, I went to the front door and changed the locks. The metal clicked softly, a sound so ordinary and yet so final it felt almost holy. When I turned the new key in the handle, I felt something deep and steady settle inside me. I stood there a long while after, the sun dipping low behind the trees, painting the porch in amber light. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked, and the world carried on like it always does. But in that quiet moment, I felt something I hadn't in years. Peace. Wasn't victory. It wasn't revenge. It was balance restored. When I closed the door behind me, it didn't slam. It whispered. It's funny how peace doesn't arrive with a sound. It doesn't knock or announce itself or come wrapped in a bright moment of realization. It just appears one day like a gentle tide that's been rising all along while you were too busy holding your breath to notice. That's how it was for me. The morning after I changed the locks, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea and listened to the ocean breathing just beyond the hill. The air had that crisp, salty chill that comes after rain, and the seagulls were calling somewhere down near the docks. For the first time in a long while, the house didn't feel like a battlefield or a memory I had to tiptoe through. It just felt like a home again. Quiet, grounded, mine. The porch boards creaked beneath my feet, the same way they always had, but now each sound felt like a heartbeat instead of a warning. I could smell the faint sweetness of the lilacs along the fence line. The curtains in the front room swayed with the breeze, and for the first time in years I left the front door open wide. I didn't need to guard anything anymore. Inside, the house still carried its familiar scents: wood polish, lavender soap, and the faint echo of coffee from years of mornings spent talking to Bill at the kitchen table. I'd cleaned and dusted every room, not because it needed it, but because I wanted to feel the weight of my hands reclaiming the space. Each stroke of the cloth, each soft sweep of the broom felt like a quiet conversation with the walls. I'd whisper little things to myself: "We're all right now," or "You've waited long enough." It sounds silly, but after losing everything that made me feel safe, talking to my home felt like talking to a dear old friend who'd finally forgiven me for leaving. I didn't expect Clara to come back, and she didn't. I'd seen her car pass by once in the distance, but she didn't stop, and I was okay with that. Forgiveness, I've learned, doesn't always mean reunion. Sometimes it's just letting the anger melt into understanding, like sugar and warm tea. You can't hold resentment and peace in the same hand. They don't fit. One afternoon I went into Clara's old room. It was empty now, sunlight streaming in through the clean windows. The walls still had faint marks from picture frames that once hung there, and I stood in the middle of the floor. I could almost hear her laughter echoing from another time. I smiled, not the kind of smile that hides pain, but the kind that comes from finally being able to remember without hurting. I touched the window frame, felt the smoothness of the wood, and said softly, "I hope you find your own peace too, sweetheart." Then I closed the door gently, not to shut her out, but to let that part of my life rest. Weeks passed, and slowly my life began to find its rhythm again. I planted herbs in the backyard: thyme, rosemary, and basil, and every morning I'd water them just before the sun got too high. I started volunteering twice a week at the local library, helping kids with reading and older folks with forms they didn't understand. People there began to know me by name again, and I liked that, being part of something small and kind. One day, while I was stacking donated books near the front desk, a young woman walked in, early 30s maybe. Her hair was tied back, her clothes simple but neat. She had that same nervous energy I remembered in myself years ago when I first started teaching. She came up to the counter and asked if there were any rooms for rent nearby. She'd just been hired to teach at the elementary school and hadn't found a place to stay yet. I don't know why, but something in her voice caught me. Maybe it was the way she said, "I just want a quiet place to start over," or maybe it was the way her eyes softened when she smiled. Whatever it was, I heard myself saying, "I might know somewhere." A week later she moved into the spare bedroom, the same one that used to hold so much silence and memory. Her name was Emily. She taught 3rd grade, and she had a way of talking that made everything sound hopeful. The first night she stayed, she brought home a small bouquet of daisies and placed them in the kitchen. "A house should have fresh flowers," she said. "It keeps the air honest." I laughed at that, a real full laugh that reached my chest. "You're right," I said. "It does." Having her around filled the house with a new kind of life. The sound of her light footsteps, the way she hummed while making coffee in the morning, it was like music I didn't know I'd been missing. She reminded me of myself when I first moved in with Bill all those years ago, full of dreams and trying to make a home out of borrowed space. Sometimes in the evenings we'd sit on the porch together, watching the light fade over the water. She'd ask about teaching and I'd share old stories, the students who made me laugh, the lessons that went wrong, the parents who brought cookies during conferences. She'd listen with that same thoughtful look I used to have when I thought the world was something you could fix with hard work and kindness. One night she asked me, "Do you ever get lonely living alone for so long?" Thought about it for a moment. The question didn't sting. It just sat gently between us. "I did," I said. "For a while. But loneliness isn't always bad. It's just the quiet that comes before peace, if you let it be." She nodded like she understood. And I think she did. There was a calmness in those days that I hadn't known in years. The house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt balanced. I'd walk by Bill's photo in the hallway and say, "Good morning," not out of grief, but out of habit, like checking in with an old friend. The air always smelled like something good, lavender from the garden, bread baking, or the faint salt of the sea carried in through the open window. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky with streaks of rose and gold, I brewed a pot of tea and took my cup to the porch. Emily had gone to meet a friend for dinner, and the house was quiet again. But this time, it wasn't an empty quiet. It was the peaceful kind. The kind that holds you instead of haunting you. I rocked slowly in my chair, the wood creaking in rhythm with the wind. I thought about everything, the years of teaching, the laughter, the betrayal, the loss, and the long road that had brought me here. Life doesn't unfold in neat lines. It bends and doubles back, sometimes breaking you just enough to show you who you really are underneath all the giving. I looked out toward the horizon where the sun met the sea and whispered, "Thank you, Bill." I wasn't sure if I was thanking him for the will, the house, or the lesson, but maybe all of it. He'd loved me in a quiet way, and maybe that was why I'd learned to love this quiet too. Before I went inside, I looked around the porch, the same one that had seen heartbreak, betrayal, and now healing. The light flickered softly through the curtains. Everything felt still and right. I smiled, not for anyone watching, but for myself. "Love doesn't mean giving everything away," I said aloud, my voice steady and soft. "Sometimes love means keeping what's yours and tending it with grace." The words lingered in the evening air, carried away by the wind toward the sea, and as the last bit of sunlight disappeared, I felt something settle in me, an ease, a knowing that I had come full circle. Because sometimes justice isn't about winning. It's about peace. It's about standing quietly in the home you built and realizing that you are enough, just as you are. And maybe that's all any of us really need in the end. If this story found its way to your heart, take a moment to share it. Maybe someone out there needs to hear that peace can come quietly too. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, about strength, love, and the quiet kind of justice, don't forget to subscribe. Until next time, may you hold on to what's yours and tend it with grace.